Good evening, and thank you for taking the time to hear about new World War II history. A special thank you to the Schaumburg Township District Library, and a special thank you to Matt Binder for organizing this event. Today, I'm going to provide a very high-level overview of the book, including background, research, and conclusions. I'll speak for about 40 minutes, and then we'll open it up for questions. And I promise you, I will stay here for as long as you have questions. I'm in no hurry. I'm not going anywhere. Last May 7th, we observed the 76th anniversary of the end of World War II in Europe. I bet a number of you have family members that were in the services during World War II. And I bet they had phenomenal stories to tell you about some of the service, some of the things that they encountered during their service. This book has fascinating stories about GI POW interactions and puts a spotlight on the importance of education to combat anti-Semitism and racism that continues to increase worldwide. I'm going to start the presentation with a 6-minute video that describes the 372,000 German POWs held in the US during World War II. A 1942 agreement between Great Britain and the United States paved the way for the US to house German POWs. No SS were allowed into the United States. We had to get POWs out of the North African and European theaters of operation so we could free up combat troops to fight, not guard. In addition, with 16 million Americans in the armed services, we needed a labor force to work in our factories and fields, and the POWs filled that role magnificently. The video ends with an overview of the Jewish GIs I researched, including their roles, responsibilities. The main conclusion of this book: these Jewish GIs reset the moral compass and re-educated many of these German POWs so that they could lead or participate in a post-war democratic Germany. Think of this as inoculation against starting another world war and Holocaust. To illustrate this, you're going to be in for a real treat. The middle of the video has film footage shot by 2 Jewish surgeons on November 22, 1944, inside the Clinton prisoner of war camp located outside of Jackson, Mississippi. In fact, that's where I am now virtually. This is one of the barracks. The whole camp has been torn down. It no longer exists. But I'm coming to you virtually from one of the barracks. In real life, I'm coming to you from the northern suburbs of Chicago. Well, November 22, 1944, by then, the US Army had reached the Rhine River. We had occupied Strasbourg, France, beautiful Alsatian town on the Rhine. And what you're going to see in the video are 2 German officers saluting these 2 Jewish GIs. Commanding officer of the station hospital, Major Harold Bellin, and his surgeon, Captain Raymond Harris. This would have never occurred in Nazi-occupied Europe. It illustrates the re-education program working. So I'm going to turn this video on and just sit back and enjoy. So what you see here are two low-ranking German officers. The gentleman on top here is believed to be a lieutenant, one that's saluting. The one on the bottom is believed to be a captain. These men are in generic uniforms. By November 1944, all German or Nazi paraphernalia that would go on uniforms, such as swastikas, iron crosses, and the like, were removed. These men are wearing generic uniforms. They're dress uniforms. They were trotted out for a show and tell in front of the Jackson, Mississippi Kiwanis Club. It was a bit of a show and tell. So that's why the two surgeons were filming this. This is Captain Raymond Harris on the right. You can see it's late November. The grass is brown. There's no leaves on the trees. You'll see a guard tower in the background. Raymond Harris will take the camera now. Bellin had a shaky hand, but here you can see Major Harold Bellin. He's returning a salute. Now they're going to reenact the salute for the camera. And the barracks you see behind are for the military police guards. They had to stay in the same type of barracks as the POWs. You'll be seeing they're going through a checkpoint Charlie to go back into the POW compound. Gate 17, you'll see a sign. That's where the station hospital for Clinton was. This is believed to be the captain waving and the lieutenant. And with that, we're now going to have a salute to the GIs who guarded the POWs. Okay, well, now we're going to put on a PowerPoint and get to the meat of how I got into all of this. Incidentally, the video just saw is on YouTube. You could search for it, and I'm sure you could. You'll find it also on the YouTube channel, the tape from this presentation. Okay, so my journey began in January 1997. Let's see, get rid of this thing here. I was in San Diego to clean up my parents' condo. They had sold the condo, moved in assisted living, and during this clean out process, I came across a green metal box that contained 50 letters my late father sent home to my late mother. At the time they were dating, they weren't married, but it documented his complete service in the Army from 42 to 45, basic training to discharge. And to my great surprise, I found letters that he had sent from the prisoner of war stockade at Camp Clinton, where he served there for almost 8 months. In addition, I had his complete discharge report, photo album, and numerous other artifacts. At the time, I was working. I had a lot of responsibility as a research and development director. I had 4 teams of scientists. I was traveling internationally. I really didn't have time to devote to do research on this. So I retired from the Wrigley Company in 2012, and I consulted for several years. And then I really got the itch to start doing the research on this. And that's when things really started in January 2014. So the first question I had was how many Jews were involved in this? How big of a story do I have? Or was my father the only one? 47,000 American personnel were involved in the prisoner of war effort in the United States. A 1947, after the war, Jewish Welfare Board report on Jewish men and women that served during the war discussed what branches they were into or where they served. And it turns out that 550,000 men and women of the Jewish faith represented 4.5% of the armed forces. 80% of these served in the Army, and of those in the Army, 8% were in ground force units that were in combat. So if you do the math, multiplying 47,000 by 4.5% times 80% by 8%, you come up with a number of about 130. And as it turns out, this appears to be woefully low. 33% of all US Jewish physicians were in uniform. 30% of Jewish dentists were in Metro New York alone. And this 1947 report didn't consider the medical corps or the dental corps, or in fact, the sanitation corps, which I found some people that were Jewish that belonged to. So I started doing research. And the first thing to do was find and interview Jewish GIs. The Jewish war veterans were very kind to me, let me put a notice in their monthly newsletter. And immediately I got a hit from an individual living in Milwaukee who was a GI that was a military policeman, and he was my first live interview. Once you find people then and you interview them, then you have to validate their stories with facts. And so I went to a number of different archival sources. Most of the veterans had their enlistment and discharge papers, or they had pictures or biographies or things that could prove that, could validate their stories and their interactions. I found particularly helpful were historical societies in states where POW camps were located, particularly Nebraska Historical Society. Places like Ancestry.com were just good for looking at census and school information of GIs to understand or document their pre-war lives. And that Newspaper.com was excellent for articles that were written about POW camps during the war years, as well as 30, 40 years after the war ended. There were reunions that took place at these camps where Germans and their families, the former POWs, came back for these reunions, and newspapers covered, and the historical societies had historians embedded for the events to record them. Fold 3 is owned by Ancestry. It has the same thing as the National Archives, the enlistment and discharge papers for the most part. I did background on German POW camps in the US, particularly those where GIs served that I wrote about. And being a scientist, I needed to learn how to think and write like a historian and understand what's the substantiation for service. So I contacted Arnold Kramer, who's a professor of history emeritus at Texas A&M. And Kramer wrote the book, the complete book. It's like a Bible about the POW experience in the United States. It came out in 1997. And my timing was terrible. I called him on the day he was going to retire the next day. And he said that, look, I'm going to refer you to my crack former PhD student, Derek Mallet, who works for the US Army War College. And Mallet turned out, wrote a book about Hitler's generals interred in the United States, one of which my father had interactions with. And so Mallet was a great resource. In fact, he wrote a foreword to my book. I also did background on anti-Semitism in the United States and in the Army during the war years, and press coverage of the Holocaust and Jewish community response to it. And this was all during the war years, particularly from 42 to 45. So,
Hey, Mike, yeah. Do you mind enlarging your Zoom slides so people can read the details on them? Right now, we can see a small version of the slide. And people were wondering if we could enlarge those and make them easier to read.
Well, I've got the slide about as high as it's full screen on mine. Is there anything I could do? I'm trying to think here.
So in the bottom right corner, there is 4 little, one looks like a bunch of squares, 4 separate squares, a book, and a display stand.
I think you got me on full screen. I can't control that. I have no way of is there something you could do about it?
No, you'd have to do it from your side. So if you go to the bottom right corner and click on the
all right, so I don't have, that's my problem here is that, okay, now here.
Yep, you're in the right spot. So click on that one right there.
That's full screen. That's the, am I full screen now?
Not yet. Is there a way that you could just hit the plus sign on the Zoom and then zoom it in that way? There we go. A little but I would just go to 100% there, or 90%.
How's that? Is that better? People see now?
Yeah, that's much better. Thank you.
Yeah, because right, typically perfect. I show it from the slideshow. And if I go slideshow, if I hit slideshow, does that screw it up?
Nothing changed. Nothing changed for us though.
Is it still? Is it back to being small?
No, it's not. Why don't we just continue? Get you back on the slide we were on, and then we'll keep going.
All right. Is it large so you could see?
Yes, it is.
Okay, perfect.
Thank you.
All right, so we already went through this. Sorry about that, ladies and gentlemen. So I needed to reach a wider audience to identify candidates. So I went to the media, to the newspapers. The Chicago Jewish News is the largest, or at least it was at the time, the largest Jewish periodical that occurred in the Chicago area. And they agreed to do a community service feature on my research. So I was interviewed by a reporter, George Castle, and the story came out in April 2016, and it described my father's service as well as 3 or 4 other GIs that I was able to track down and get stories on. And I got immediate response. 4 GIs or families responded: Harris, Froman, Heinrich, and Wise. Harris was still living. I was able to interview him. Froman, his son contacted me, Michael Froman, and it was really funny because I hadn't heard from him for over 50 years. We went to grammar school and high school together. So each of these individuals had complete stories of their pre-war, war service, and post-war lives. The Chicago Jewish News wasn't search engine optimized on their website, and the stories that were published in the print versions never made it on their website. So I posted a similar story on the Digital Chicago Tribune, and this went all over the place. I then placed links to the story on Facebook groups, and I got a large number of hits. This led me to the two physicians that were at Clinton that you saw in the video. Jason Silverman, you're going to meet in a little bit, and a number more. Additional tools for finding people and getting information was death notices that were in synagogue bulletins, obituaries. Funeral homes led me to family members to interview, and even men's clubs. I'm a former president of the Midwest Region Federation of Jewish Men's Clubs, and there were clubs in Wisconsin and Missouri, as well as Illinois, that sent me names of people to pursue. Jack Weiner turned out to be a military policeman that guarded POWs in the upper reaches of the Upper Peninsula of Michigan. I got his story from someone in Milwaukee. Sheldon Green served at a camp located in Glenview, Illinois, of all places. And that this particular camp was called Camp Skokie Valley, and it was located directly across the street from a famous restaurant. I'm getting brain cramp here, but it's on Harms Road in Glenview. The restaurant existed during the war years, and MPs used to go there for beers. So results to date, after all this work, 4 years of research, I was able to find 33 Jewish GIs. If you see a name that's completely underlined, that means I have the complete pre-war, war service, and post-war stories and how the three interacted. In the case of one individual, you see no underline. This individual, Harvey Goldberg, served with Bellin and Harris. I have them in pictures, but I've never was able to find anyone to interview, and no living family members. Individuals that have one blue star have Chicago roots. Two red stars have New York roots, since I've been doing some presentations in New York State and New York City. I'm going to talk to you in a little bit about my father and Jason Silverman. The physicians all have fabulous stories, and I may touch upon them later if we have more time. A whole slew of military police. The 475th Military Police Escort Guard, which is down over here. This particular unit, I have their complete war service. They wrote a book. The book is in, of all places, the Kalamazoo, Michigan Public Library. I was able to gain access to it. They also had a website which recently disappeared, but the book lives on. But it had their entire war record, but I've never was able to find anyone I could interview for the pre-war and post-war lives.
Hi, Mike, we're not seeing your slides advance. You're going to have to click on each one by one as they come up. There we go. Now we can see them.
I'm just going to keep this here, not on slideshow.
Perfect.
All right. The interesting thing about this is that the average age of the infantryman in the United States Army was 26. 50% were high school graduates. Only 10% had college. All the men I studied were high school graduates. Many, as you could see on the left side, the physicians all had postdoctoral work or went to graduate school. Silverman was an attorney. Feldman had a master's in sanitation. So this was a fairly highly educated group. The youngest man was tied between Sheldon Cohen and Irwin Harris at 18 years of age when they entered the Army. Bellin was the oldest at 38, and Shapiner, who lived in Kankakee, Illinois after the war, was 37. Sheldon Cohen served at the farthest southern POW camp, Camp Mejia, M-E-X-I-A. We saw the matchbook in the video. and that Jack Weiner's right below him served at the furthest northern part, which was in Upper Peninsula, Michigan. Okay, let's see here. Have to do a manual here. So why tell the story? This particular story is, it's an honor for me to tell the story. And why is it an honor? Because I got to meet veterans, interview them, get to meet their families and tell their service. This is Erwin Harris from Chicago. You see him here pictured with a copy of my book in February 2019. February 2019. He was in a nursing home in Morton Grove when I first interviewed him several years prior to that. He was in a independent living place, and we had many great conversations about his service, had phenomenal documentation. He passed away the next month. I attended the funeral. The family asked me to do a eulogy about his military service, which I proudly did. And believe me, that alone made all the years of research, blood, sweat, and tears of writing and editing worth it. Unfortunately, this doesn't, because I'm going to have to, all right, this is also a story of untold heroic action. And that these GIs entered POW compounds without firearms. They were they were outnumbered 10 to 1, sometimes 100 to 1. They were subjected to anti-Semitic taunts, bodily harm, and sometimes threats of death. In the case of bodily harm and death, usually the POW was then sent to solitary confinement. There's also, this is a major story, Repair the World. We're going to come back to that in just a second or two. But it's also to counter inaccurate generalizations of the quality of soldiers stationed at the POW camps. Post-war reports painted these men as incompetent, mentally unfit, and not capable of serving in POW camps, and definitely not serving overseas. This certainly didn't pertain to the men that I researched. So repair the world. And Rabbi Schneerson says it best. If you see what needs to be repaired in the world and how to repair it, then it's a piece of the world that God has left for you to complete. But if you see only what is wrong and what is ugly, and you don't do anything about it, then you're the one that needs to be repaired. So this repair the world started out by repairing individuals on a one-on-one basis, GI to POW. Many of the POWs had family in the United States and shared stories with GIs. They wanted to learn about American Jews and the rank and stature of Jews. The Geneva Convention indicated POWs could work, so Jews trained them and supervised them. And at the end of the presentation, you're going to meet an individual that really wanted to work in the station hospital at Clinton, Mississippi. And Major Harold Bellin approved these two individuals to work in the hospital. Both of them, after the war, became physicians, one of which came to the United States and set up a heart clinic in Columbus, Ohio. And it's just a phenomenal story. And I'm going to tell you a little bit more about this at the end. Towards the end of the war, as we liberated Europe, we crossed the Rhine. March and April, we started liberating concentration camps, and it became quite apparent that there were a large number of atrocities committed. So in June and July 1945, POWs were forced to see concentration camp films and discuss these in discussion groups with re-education specialists and translators. Anti-Nazis were placed in re-education programs before being returned to Europe. These were special camps set up for educating POWs to become mayors or police chiefs. And what we were doing is we were setting up an infrastructure of individuals to lead a post-war democratic Germany. Now, there's something important you need to understand. Out of the 372,000 German POWs, think of it as a bell-shaped curve. 15% of that population were diehard anti-Nazis. So they were on the white side of the curve. You go to the left side of the bell-shaped curve, 15 to 20% were diehard pro-Nazis. There was no way you were going to convince them on anything. In fact, we had to set up special camps, such as Camp Alva in northwestern Oklahoma, where anti-Nazis were shipped there because they were holding kangaroo court, beating anti-Nazis, or even hanging some. And so we had to separate the two. So the Jewish GIs that trained the POWs were change agents and enablers. They reset the POW moral compass. So I'm going to briefly go through some top line stories of GI experiences. The book is laid out so that you get each individual, you get their pre-war lives, how it prepared them for their war service, and how the two interacted with their post-war lives, how it affected their post-war lives. And so the book is also sectioned into the medical and corps, the military police, and the translators. A special section was held for two individuals I'm going to tell you about, my father and Jason Silverman, which didn't fit into either one of these. So my father served at the Clinton prisoner of war camp, and it's on this map, some 30 miles outside of Jackson, Mississippi. So my father and Louis Froman didn't know Bellin or Harris. Bellin and Harris didn't know Greenberg or Froman, and Greenberg and Froman didn't know each other. In fact, Greenberg and Froman could have sat next to each other in PTA meetings and didn't know that they served in the same camp at the same time. There were about 300 US personnel at the Clinton POW camp. And so unless you worked with someone, there was no way you could really get to know someone well. Bellin and Harris worked with each other. In fact, they both lived off camp in Jackson, Mississippi, and their families socialized together. This is a schematic diagram of the Clinton prisoner of war camp. In fact, I think did I skip a slide? Well, looks like this isn't going to quite work out on this without going to, but to put it in perspective, this camp held 3,700 POWs, 262 US personnel. So you could see they're outnumbered at least 10 to 1. It was the only camp to house German generals. And this is a barbed wire ringing this camp. There's a separate facility that you can't see over here that held the 25 high-ranking German officers, the generals and admirals. This POW recreation area are two football fields back to back where they played soccer. That gives you sort of a sense for how big this is. Each one of these barracks held 50 men. So the US personnel had to stay in the same type of barracks, same type of cots or bunks, bedding, etc., same type of food by Geneva Convention. So my father was born and raised in Chicago. He attended Englewood High School on the south side of Chicago. That particular high school was well diversified. It had 25% African American, 12% Jewish. The rest was primarily German, Irish, and any ethnic group you could think of. My father, in the home, they spoke Yiddish. In high school, he took 2 years of German, so he had a fundamental knowledge of German from Yiddish, as well as taking German in high school. He liked science, so he took a lot of chemistry. When he graduated, he wanted to go into pharmacy, so he entered pre-med at Crane Junior College. This lasted a year, and then the junior college system in Chicago went bankrupt due to the Depression. Him and his brother scraped up some money together and opened up a liquor store on the south side, and it did very well. He got a lot of experience in inventory control, supply management, hiring, firing people, marketing, everything an entrepreneur would want to know. Pearl Harbor comes along, and in July 42, my father's drafted. He's then sent to Camp Swift in Texas, which is about 30 miles or so outside of Waco, Texas. And within a 1-year period of time, he received 3 promotions and reached staff sergeant. He was asked to take the officer candidate school test, which he did. He passed all 3. The 3 tests are a medical exam, a written test, and an oral defense, where the commanding officer of your division and 2 of his colleagues quiz you on what you would do under combat conditions. He was then transferred to Fort Sam Houston, Texas, outside of San Antonio, for additional training. When he returned, there was a new commanding officer of his division who promptly declared all these officers' candidate school test results are null and valid. You have to take them all over again, which he did. He passed all 2, but he failed the oral exam. No explanations were offered. In a letter to his girlfriend, he indicated the only questions he got was about his ethnic background, where he went to church and why he didn't go to church. Why did he go to synagogue? Why his parents didn't go to church. So with that, he requested a transfer. And he went from the frying pan to the fire because he wound up at the Clinton prisoner of war camp outside of Jackson, Mississippi. And the letters home tell the story. The first letter home, he indicates this place is a mud hole. It's muddy, smoky, damp, dirty. The weather here is miserable. It rained for 2 days in a row. The next letter, 10 days later or so, he indicates that it's rained for 10 days in a row. And so you could see why I'm not in one of my better moods. And so here you could see the happy camper standing outside a barracks door at Clinton in beautiful downtown Jackson, Mississippi. Well, now he's going to meet his new friends at Clinton. February 27, 1944 letter, he indicates, Dear Betty, they, referring to the German prisoners of war, hate Jews. They know I am one. Some doubt that I'm Jewish, but I have assured them that I am Jewish. I guess there are better places to be. So we're going to examine this in a little bit more detail. Despite all this, he stopped trying to transfer. Humor reappeared in letters. Why? This job is without doubt the easiest yet in the Army. And this was what he concluded when he was transferred out in late August 1944. So let's examine this thing about you don't look Jewish. And a number of GIs that I interviewed had the same experience. Now, unfortunately, because I can't use the slideshow, we're going to have to maneuver things a little bit, ladies and gentlemen. I don't know how this is going to quite work out, but so the average age of the Africa Corps was 22. The first 125,000 prisoners of war came from North Africa. And this group was in grammar school or middle school in the mid-1930s after the Nazi Party came to power. And there was a propaganda and smear campaign concerning Jews and not to trust Jews. So what you see on the left is a textbook that appeared at the time, Don't Trust a Fox in a Green Meadow or An Oath of the Jew. And it created a persona or a visual of Jews being grubby, obese, dirty, smoking, not clean. Then another textbook compared the ideal Aryan versus the Jewish businessmen. Once again, the same sort of visual, smoking, obese, shifty-eyed, dirty, while the German Aryan is clean, buff. Then, well, let's see if I could get this. When they reached North Africa and they conscripted Jews to build tank defenses around the capital of Tunis in April 1943, they experienced Jews that looked like this. This picture came from the Holocaust Museum in Paris. There was a whole presentation about the Jews in the Middle East and Tunisia and what they had to go through under Nazi occupation. There wasn't a Holocaust that took place, but they were still murdered, and to a certain extent, and we'll find out about that later. And then when they arrived in the POW camps, they would meet Jews that looked like this, like Sergeant John Newmeyer, fit, trim, buff, and holding rank. Okay, let's see how we're going to change slides now. Okay. So in February 1944, he writes that he now has 2 companies of Germans, each with a supply sergeant reporting directly under his supervision. And here you could see where he writes, there's 8 guards per 1,000 prisoners of war. If trouble breaks out, by the time help arrives, I'll be a goner. But he gets along fine with them. He holds conversations with them in broken German and English. The POWs some of them speak pretty good English. They have relatives that lived in the US, Chicago, New York, and Detroit. And ladies and gentlemen, these men, the GIs as well as the POWs, would be spending days, weeks in a supply depot, and conversations are bound to break out. And so that there was a culture exchange that took place during these times. In April 1944, he had no opportunity to observe Passover. Unlike when he was at Camp Swift in 1943, he had a pass to go to a friend's home in Waco, Texas for a Seder. But in this case, he didn't have that. The 2 Jewish physicians who lived in Jackson, Mississippi, went to synagogue there and held Seders with their families there. But if you're not an officer, well, you're just out of luck. But he has a good sense of humor, because he writes, during this period of time, he's censoring packages sent to POWs. You have to check these for contraband. And during the week of Passover, I looked for matzah packages sent to POWs. If I found any, it would be one for Ripley's, believe it or not. So here you could see he still has a sense of humor intact. To give you an idea, here's a typical menu that occurred exactly on May 12, 1944 at Clinton. And you could see that the POWs ate pretty darn well. Too bad the GIs that were in captivity with the Germans, our flyers, and infantrymen that were captured didn't eat this well. But the point being here is that it's tough to be observant Jew, because you'd be violating dietary laws by eating pork or having milk with bread. And you had to have the same menu as the POWs based on the Geneva Convention. So you just had to make do. In July 1944, I was shocked when I read this letter. My father never told me about his service at Clinton. He only told me about his service in France. But I found out in reading this letter that he was a guard for the highest ranking Nazi general captured during World War II, Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. He was put in charge of the officers' compound, those 25 huts where these officers kept, and he had to inspect them on a daily basis. Von Arnim was the one in command in Tunisia. In early March 1943, Erwin Rommel, the Desert Fox, left the Africa Corps to go to Europe to help with the defenses of Normandy. Von Arnim was placed in charge of the Africa Corps. And at that time, Germany didn't have air power in that part of the world in the Middle East, and they didn't have sea power, so they couldn't get supplies in. So the Africa Corps surrendered in May 1943. They literally ran out of ammunition. So my father inspected the building daily, and due to security reasons, there were no other information in subsequent letters. In fact, this was a major violation of secrecy by indicating von Arnim was there in the first place. And the press never found out about von Arnim until well after the war. So I was interested in von Arnim. Who was he, and why did my father guard this man? So I began doing research on von Arnim, and 2 recent books that were published about 7-8 years ago, one by 2 German historians and another one by a historian that was studying the fate of Jews in Morocco and Tunisia, both indicated that von Arnim was involved in the deaths of 2,600 Tunisian Jews. Why? His subordinates, under his subordinates and an SS commander, Rausch, who enslaved 5,000 Jews to build tank defenses and build pits around Tunis, the capital, were not allowed in air raid shelters. Many of these Jews were killed in bombing raids. In addition, the men that were in the Africa Corps were getting into the Jewish quarter and were literally looting stores, were forcing Jews to give them gold and give them money, and were raping Jewish women. The situation got so bad that the night before the final battle, von Arnim issued an order that all troops had to maintain positions in their foxholes and trenches and not go into the city. So if von Arnim, if this would have been known prior to the Nuremberg trials, maybe he would have been tried as a war criminal, if not in Nuremberg, maybe in Dachau, where trials were conducted, such as the German officers that machine gunned 100 GIs during the Malmedy massacre during the battle, a little bit after the Battle of the Bulge. And if someone wants to ask the question on why my father was selected to guard the generals in the Q&A session, I'll be happy to give you my opinion on this. So in August, he was transferred to a medical detachment group and he left for France in September 1944. He spent the rest of the war years until the surrender at a hospital in Le Mans, France, where he supervised GIs, 5 enlisted men, sterilizing bandages, making IV solutions. So he finally was given a job that was fit for his background in his prior war life. The war ends in May 1945, and there's a VE parade in Le Mans, France. And you can see here's a photo from my father's photo album. Summer 1945, he's assigned for training for the invasion of Japan at Camp Cleveland. He injured his back during that training. He was hospitalized in France, then in the US. Finally discharged December 1945. The injury haunted him for the rest of his life. But nonetheless, his story is one of one-on-one repair of the world. Next, you're going to meet 2 GIs from Fort Robinson that re-educated not one-on-one, but one on thousands and one on 10,000s. Jason Silverman grew up in the Boston area, got a law degree. He was in the Army Reserve before the war. 2 months before Pearl Harbor, his unit was activated, sent to Louisiana for jungle fighting training. Pearl Harbor comes along, happens. His unit's transferred to the Pacific. He saw combat on Guadalcanal, got shot twice, got a really bad case of malaria, was hospitalized for close to a year, and then was assigned to an intellectual diversion program, was promoted from lieutenant to captain, but was given the title Assistant Executive Officer. And this was the title that formally appeared on the registration of the POW camp, because you had the International Red Cross and the Swiss delegations every several months visiting all the POW camps, and they were checking for compliance with the Geneva Convention, and that they would send a report directly back to Berlin. So the Assistant Executive Officer was a generic title because we didn't want the Germans to know that we were training their men, re-educating them from Nazism. And we'll get to this in a little bit more detail. After the war, incidentally, Silverman continued his career as an attorney, but in community service. He was the director of communications at the national headquarters of the Anti-Defamation League based in Washington, D.C. John Neumeier was originally from Frankfurt, Germany. He grew up in Frankfurt. His mother was a very successful German opera singer. His father was a successful businessman. Prior to his bar mitzvah in Frankfurt, he received a Leica camera and he photographed life in pre-Nazi Germany in Frankfurt, and then after the Nazis came to power. Kristallnacht comes along. He photographed synagogues in flame. The following morning, he went out and he photographed the smashed store windows, the men being beaten, and he was able to get away with it because he was blonde-haired and blue eyes. He didn't look Jewish. Both his father and John were able to get a visa and then left for Minneapolis, Minnesota. He went to the University of Minnesota for 3 years. He almost completed his degree and then was drafted and then became the head translator at Fort Robinson. His mother never got out of Germany. She was arrested by the Gestapo and was murdered at Majdanek concentration camp. Neumeier found out about it 5 years after the war. Incidentally, Fort Robinson is located in the far northwest corner of Nebraska. This fort was set up in the 1870s for the Army to wage war against the Native Americans. What you don't see here because of the slide is sort of cut off is the Pine Ridge Indian reservations here. This particular fort had backup troops for the Wounded Knee Massacre. In fact, the Lakota war chief Crazy Horse surrendered here at this fort and was murdered in the fort. For those of you that may have recalled the movie Cheyenne Autumn, way back, it was a John Ford movie, there was a breakout of the Cheyenne from Fort Robinson into a blizzard, and many of these Native Americans froze to death. A little bit of sordid history of this particular fort. Prior to World War II, it was a horse and mule remount station where they trained horses to do hauling, let's say, and mules to haul packages and to be involved in jungle warfare and mountain warfare. So in June 1945, sorry about that, this is cut off, Nazi atrocity films were shown at Fort Robinson, as they were in all the other prisoner of war camps. All POWs were required to see these and to enter discussion groups. Neumeier told me the story that's shown here, and it was published in a newspaper, in which the German prisoner of war spokesman, Hunmütter, when he saw the movies and photographs of the emaciated concentration camp inmates looking out from their wooden bunks, he insisted they were not Jews, but concentration camp inmates in India incarcerated by British imperialists. This man turned out to be a pro-Nazi, and that he was sent to Camp Elva, where 5,000 other diehard pro-Nazis were kept. And a new camp spokesperson was installed. You'll meet this individual at the end of the presentation. So 20,000 prisoners of war were surveyed after attending films and discussion groups. Only 36% thought the camps were true. And when I first saw this statistic, I thought, oh man, this is terrible. But when you think about it, only 15 to 20% were anti-Nazis. Well, now maybe we're getting closer to 40%. We've convinced people that Nazism was wrong. Many that were in the German army that saw these films were disgusted. 1,000 POWs burned their uniforms in protest at Camp Buechner. Several thousand that volunteered to join the army to fight the Japanese, and then later the Russians, and they were turned down with a very polite thank you very much. Many donated canteen funds to the Red Cross. So we had our work cut out for us. We had to really start educating people, these German POWs, about what life was like in the United States. We had to educate them about the Bill of Rights, freedom of religion, freedom of speech. We had to educate them on thinking independently, not following the herd to do wrong, as well as the Constitution, the American system of finance, and government. So in 1946, a crash re-education course occurred that lasted for 6 months, till actually from January to April 1946, at Fort Eustis, which is right on the coast in Southern Virginia. 2,000 anti-Nazis selected from the 500 POW camps by the assistant executive officers that thought that these individuals were trainable to be to lead government. So they took a 6-day, 10-hour, 6-day course, 10 hours a day on learning about the US Constitution and system of government. 24,000 students completed this program before it was shut down. Each cycle had a graduation ceremony, a valedictorian, a guest speaker, and the press in attendance. By this time, the war was over, and we didn't give a crap about the Swiss delegation or the International Red Cross. We were out to change hearts and minds. So John Neumeier was a lecturer and discussion leader during this program. He taught philosophy and democracy, as well as English. I talked with Neumeier for hours about his service and about these programs, and this was intense. And if POWs skipped the course, they were thrown out. And the 340,000 prisoners that did not take this course did not return to Germany until 1947. They were all shipped out to Europe after June, July 1946. The last POW left July 23, 1946. And the POWs that didn't attend these courses were sent to France and England for war reparation work and weren't released until 1947 to return to their bombed out homes in Germany. With Neumeier was another German Jewish refugee, Henry Ehrman, that John knew and talked about. Ehrman had a professor of law degree. He was a judge in Berlin. Nazis came to power. They threw him out. He left Germany, went to the United States. The provost marshal of the United States Army recruited him to become in charge of the German history department at Fort Getty. And this particular fort, prior to Fort Eustis, towards the end, middle of the end of 1945, was where they trained mayors, candidates to be mayors in German cities and towns. So this is an example of repair of the world at its best. Post-war, Neumeier received a PhD in philosophy. He taught philosophy at University of Minnesota for a few years, became president of Morehead State University. The dormitory there is still named after him. He became regional director of the Anti-Defamation League in North Dakota and Minnesota. He left Morehead State University for a better position at State University of New York at New Paltz. He was president there. He retired in 1972 and he became a newspaper columnist for the Kingston Daily Freeman, which is right near New Paltz. And he wrote extensively about the Holocaust, about life after the Nazis took over and what it was like for Jews, and his firsthand experience for life in Nazi Germany before the war. He never wrote about his war service, but I wrote about that and took care of that with him. And this man, I couldn't get him off the phone. He would talk and give you detail after detail. It was just incredible. He would send emails that would go on for pages. I wanted to bring him to my synagogue to talk in April 2016 for a Yom HaShoah. That's a Holocaust Remembrance Day that's celebrated in Israel and the United States. But he was too sick. And then he passed away on Memorial Day 2016. And he, and just like the other GIs I interviewed, just really left a hole in my heart. So conclusion on the 17 GIs that I had full stories on, all came from diverse backgrounds. They grew up with other racist religions. They experienced anti-Semitism and racism before the Army. One of the individuals, Raymond Harris, the surgeon that you saw in the video, grew up in rural southern Georgia, and the Klan was active there. And the town that Harris grew up in, they lynched a black man and they forced all the white citizens to march past the corpse hanging from a tree. During that period of time, Harris was in college at Yale and missed out on that. But within a 5-mile radius or a 50-mile radius, there were like 10 lynchings that took place. So, and Jack Weiner, who grew up in Milwaukee, Wisconsin, who was the guard at the Upper Peninsula of Michigan, he grew up when the German-American Bund was holding Nazi youth camps outside of Kenosha, Wisconsin. And it wasn't until the FBI found that the leader of the Bund was embezzling money that they were able to shut down the whole American Nazi Party back in the late 1930s. But all these GIs had education and life's experiences that prepared them for service. All had high school diplomas, many went to college. Some started their own businesses before the war. Some played team sports or were in ROTC. And during their service, 11 were promoted, 5 to sergeants, 1 to corporal, and all the physicians were promoted to officers, as was the sanitation officer and Jason Silverman. And that they had the mental and moral strength to venture, persevere, and withstand the difficulties in dealing with POWs or Army anti-Semitism. If you look at the book, and I'm not here to sell the book, but there's documented cases of Army anti-Semitism. There's even a letter that I was able to get from the Nebraska Historical Society that documented they wanted to get rid of Jason Silverman because the commanding officer of Fort Robinson said, I have too many Jewish officers. I got it in writing. That whole thing got shot down by the provost marshal. So what did these men have in common? They all had positive, negative interactions with POWs. 4 experienced Army anti-Semitism. Staying observant as a Jew was hard to do. All had meaningful post-war lives, all led successful business or academic or community service careers. Incidentally, not everything was love and roses between the GIs and the German POWs. There is one particular GI that I got to get a lot of information on, Leonard Levy. He graduated from the University of Michigan. He was really into politics, a young guy. And what did the Army do after they drafted him? They sent him to the worst possible place, Camp Elva, where all the die-hard Nazis were kept. And so this man received a lot of verbal abuse. And he cracked. He took his rifle, and he smashed the jaw of a prisoner of war, and he was busted down from sergeant to private. And it affected him in his post-war life. He hated Germans. He didn't want to ever go to Germany. But yet, this man got a PhD in history. He taught history at Brandeis University, was dean. He was let's say, first in charge of the Department of History, then became a dean for the university. And he wrote a book on the Constitution and the amendment that guarantees a right to a trial by your peers. And he got a Pulitzer Prize for it. So here's a man who despised Germans, but had a terrible experience, but got a Pulitzer Prize on a subject that dealt with what the Nazis denied people from. So I just thought there's a lot of cool, interesting stories that sort of spun off from this research. So most of these men had Jewish children that were bar mitzvahed or confirmed. Many continued with veterans or community involvement, especially teaching others racial intolerance, especially not to follow the herd to do wrong. Repair the world by repairing individuals. Rabbi Elliot Dorff sort of speaks to this. The way we speak to people is at the forefront of the Jewish tradition on how to build a better world. So repair the world could occur not through physical repair, such as construction projects, but mental repair, repairing souls, repairing minds. Degrading others is prohibited by the Jewish tradition. We don't have to like everyone. We don't have to approve what people say or what they do, but we have to show respect, at least to them in the image of God with them, and just let them hear them out, listen to them. So Jews were raised with the understanding of halakha. And this consists of 3 particular legs. Morality, civil and criminal law, and ethics. Zedek, which is understanding criminal law and religious law. Tikkun olam, which is repair of the world, which takes into account ethics and how we treat people. And tzedakah, which is charity, having compassion for people. And when these men went to synagogue, and many were Orthodox, after the services on Saturday, there would be discussions from the section of the Old Testament called the Ethics of the Fathers. And one of the things that was drilled in their heads was it's wrong to side with the majority, to do wrong. And that's what they preached to the POWs. So how many POWs did they possibly interact with? So at the 20 different camps, these Jews possibly could have interacted with 51,000. One GI, John Neumeier, served at 4 camps. Besides Robinson, he was at 3 re-education camps, and he definitely interacted with 27,000 POWs. The 4 physicians, Bellin and Harris, at least had to give physicals to close to 3,000 prisoners of war or deal with taking out their or caring for their war wounds from North Africa. Fleck, granted, there's not enough time to talk about the physicians, but Stephen Fleck served at Aliceville. That's the largest POW camp. Northwest Alabama held 8,000 POWs. And that's where it was at the end of the war. But when he started, it was 6,000 there. He had to screen 5,300 for diphtheria. Now, diphtheria is a gram-positive bacteria disease that is transferred by the breath and saliva. Sounds like the current virus that we're dealing with. It's very virulent. It transfers easy. And there's a whole story behind how he screened people and treated POWs for this particular ailment and stopped it cold. Shapiner, who served at Livingston in Louisiana, treated 148 POWs for malaria cases. Both Fleck and Shapiner published their studies that they did in peer-reviewed scientific journals in 1944. The families that I interviewed had no idea of this. Being a former scientist, I searched the scientific literature and came up with these papers, and it was a complete war service record for these 2 individuals. So the families were very grateful. Incidentally, Fleck was rewarded for his efforts. In 1944, he was sent to Europe with a field hospital. He followed Patton into Germany. And once the camps were liberated, he took a jeep and ambulances to Theresienstadt to treat inmates, and later to Buchenwald. Fleck grew up in Frankfurt, Germany, and there's a whole story about his background and how he came back to Germany for a scientific conference at the insistence of his son, who I interviewed. So it makes for really great reading. So did the Jews make a difference at all? Now, this is really messed up here because I don't have the slideshow capability. So more prisoners of war from the Fort Robinson camp entered the re-education effort than any other camp. Over 800 entered the 24,000 re-education effort. Fort Eudis, one of the graduates, Baron Rudiger von Weckmar, became the ambassador to the United Nations for West Germany in 1979. Then I mentioned earlier that 2 Clinton prisoner of war hospital workers received permission by Harold Bellin to work in a hospital. The neurologist, a gentleman who became a neurologist after the war, Joseph Huber, was an orderly, and Gustav Joachim was a blood technician. And here they are pictured on the steps outside the station hospital. I'm not sure who this man is. He has nothing to do with the hospital for sure. He's not a doctor. So I was very interested, and I discovered Joachim through a newspaper article of a 1976 article in the Jackson Ledger newspaper in Mississippi, that Joachim attended the Clinton prisoner of war camp reunion, and the paper mentioned that he was a heart surgeon in Columbus, Ohio. And so I chased him down, and I found that both his sons are in the medical directory of Columbus, Ohio. And I called the sons where they worked, and I connected with one of them and told him I was doing research and I wanted to interview, get some facts about his father. And I already knew before talking to the son that Joachim passed away 3-4 years prior to my contacting them, and that the obituary was very interesting. It said that he was a pillar of the community in Columbus. He gave to philanthropic causes. He had several heart clinics, and he was an excellent surgeon. He was well regarded by his colleagues. He had 2 sons that were physicians. And so it also mentioned he served in the Army during World War II. It just failed to mention which Army, which I thought was pretty humorous. So the son connected me with Joachim's widow, and she told me the entire story from the time that Gustav Joachim, entered the Army until the time that he passed away. Turned out that Joachim was 18 when he was conscripted into the German Army, and his father warned him, please don't volunteer for anything. Just whatever they give you, take it. And so he was given a choice to go to either Russia or North Africa. And he chose North Africa. Wise move. He probably would have been killed in Russia, or the Russians would have killed him. So Joachim was captured by the Americans in Tunisia, shipped to Clinton, and he became a blood technician, as mentioned before. After the war, he did war reparation work in France, then went to Heidelberg Medical School. Believe me, Heidelberg is a beautiful German city. If you have never been there, it's very well worth the while. It's one of the few German cities that wasn't bombed into the dark ages, so to speak. But it's got a beautiful castle, a beautiful city. So he completed medical school, did an internship, got married, brought his young bride to Columbus, Ohio, and then opened up a heart clinic. And that's a story that one a Tikkun alum that keeps on living, because now his sons are passing on Repair the World by repairing people's hearts. Other post-war communications and testimonials were important. A former Clinton prisoner of war by the name of Teskey provided an oral digital testimony in the Imperial War College. I was able to access it. And Teskey talks about the great surgical treatment he treated by Bellin and Harris removing shrapnel from his leg. Jack Weiner exchanged letters with prisoners of war that he knew from Upper Peninsula of Michigan, and this continued well after the war. Weiner became executive director of the Jewish Community Center in Milwaukee, and then was very instrumental in opening up overnight camps in Michigan and Wisconsin. So to end things, as I mentioned before, many prisoners of war traveled to US for reunions. And the former prisoner of war spokesman, the one that replaced Hohenmutter, who was the diehard Nazi, his replacement, Wolfgang Dorschel, went on a trip with Jason Silverman to a fort in North Dakota in June 1945 for a re-education seminar. Silverman and Dorschel were going there to talk about the great program that they had at Fort Robinson. And on the way to North Dakota, Silverman took a detour through the Black Hills and showed Dorschel Mount Rushmore. Upon seeing Mount Rushmore, Dorschel explained, this is the temple of democracy. And so here you could see this Repair the World program really worked well. Okay, this is not wanting to cooperate again, so whoops. So what's in it? What's next for me, if we could ever get there? So the book was published in January 2019, got a lot of great press reviews. New stories are emerging. I'm not so sure I'm going to do a second edition of the book. I'm really burned out after 4 years of research, 1 year writing, and I've been on the speaking circuit now since easily 2019. In fact, I was giving presentations before the book published, and that's how I was able to find Schreiner. His grandson stepped forward and said, hey, my grandfather served at Livingston. Anyways, so I'm not telling people to buy the book for their own personal use. It's an educational tool. If you we're so kind you could buy a book for your local high school, your church or your synagogue, or even buy a book for the Schaumburg Public Library for crying out loud. It would be a great honor. So I'm going to end with the final slide. My research took me to the battlefields of Normandy. I hired a historian, and I was really interested in finding stories of GIs that served at POW internment camps some 3-4 miles inland from Utah Beach. It just didn't quite work out. But while touring these fortifications on Normandy, I shot this picture out of a German bunker at Utah Beach. And this bunker had a sister bunker that was faced in a way that you could have a crossfire. And on this very spot, 200 GIs died in a hail of bullets from machine guns from this bunker and the other bunker. So I think it's appropriate we end here, because this is why we fought. We fought to liberate Europe. We fought to liberate people and to teach people about their freedoms, to create a democratic Germany. And I'm going to end with how we end services in synagogue on Saturday mornings. We say a prayer for peace. And so there's a line in the prayer that goes, I will rid the land of vicious beasts, and it shall not be ravaged by war. So veterans, thank you for making this all possible. And with that, that concludes my presentation. And so I'll be happy to entertain any questions. And I'm going to count on Matt to maybe read off the questions, and then I could attempt to answer these things. I'm going to stop sharing this.
Yeah, absolutely. Absolutely.
Like
okay, so we
go ahead.
Yeah, we have quite a few questions here. Donald asks, were more Jewish soldiers kept out of Europe because if captured by the Nazis, there was a higher chance of being mistreated and or killed, either within the POW camps or even before getting into the camps?
Quite honestly, based on what I've read, I don't think the Army paid attention to if they were going to be captured or not. They sent them to where they saw fit. Incidentally, one of the MPs, the guy that was at Mejia, Texas, you saw a picture of him, it was Sheldon Cohn. After his unit did a tour of duty at that POW camp, their whole unit got shipped out to France. He fought in the Battle of the Bulge. Then later, he was a guard at internment camps. Now you think 372,000 POWs in the US is a large number. On Easter Sunday, 1945, 300,000 Germans surrendered en masse east of Cologne, Germany. So Sheldon Cohn was involved in guarding these people. Massive barbed wire internment camps were put together. Feeding these people was a real problem, which is another story. But believe me, the other men that I knew that went to Europe, in fact, the military police escort guard, the 475th, the 6 members, they all went to Europe and brought back POWs in cargo ships. They did a number of transoceanic voyages, but these men didn't think twice about it. But if they were in combat and they were in danger of possibly being captured, I do know if you read Citizen Soldier, or if you read some of the stories that are at the National World War II Museum, I know that there were Jews that ripped off their dog tags and threw them away so that they couldn't be identified as Jews. Well, thank you for your question.
Yeah. You kind of answered this a little bit, but someone wants to know how the German POWs got to the States while the war was still going on.
In the case of Tunisia, they were all rounded up into large internment centers, and then cargo ships that carried GIs and supplies to Great Britain would then come back and pick up POWs and military police escort guards, and then ship them back to the United States. Now, the video that I showed sort of talked to this. If you go to YouTube, if you had trouble seeing the video, it's on YouTube. If you search image tripping or you search Jews guarding Nazi POWs, it should come up in the event that the YouTube video of this particular program doesn't show it well. But in a nutshell, that's how it did it. And then most of the North African Germans arrived by around July, August 43. And it wasn't until after we invaded Normandy, and it wasn't well until about August after we took Paris, that you started seeing POWs coming in massive numbers to the United States by cargo ship. Many of you may not know, but in August of 1944, there was another invasion of France. This took place in the near Nice, France, in the Riviera area, and they weren't there to vacation. This was 200,000 American and French soldiers that invaded France there, and they pushed north with the Italian and Swiss borders sort of paralleling, and they were the ones that liberated Strasbourg, France, in the Alsace region. So there were two armies coming across France, one that entered Normandy that was heading to the east, and the other was heading to the north. And there's just some amazing stories about the army that invaded and conquered Strasbourg, because they were the first army to cross the Rhine River. It didn't occur at Remagen like you read in the history books or the World War II history, or the History Channel tells you. 1,000 men crossed in late November 1944, and a scouting party, and went across the Black Forest, and all the way down to the Swiss border, maybe 30 miles to the north of Strasbourg on the German side, and found that the Germans bugged out and moved north. And then there's a book written about it. If someone's interested, I could direct you to it. There was a debate on whether they should have a mass invasion into Germany from that point, and Eisenhower nixed it and sent about 50,000 troops north to support Patton's group, and the rest is history. We had the Battle of the Bulge, and historians argue that if we would have invaded by Strasbourg, maybe we would have prevented the bloody Battle of the Bulge. But the rest is just history. Thank you for your question.
Hank would like to know, how could the American Army be sure that the anti-Nazis were actually so?
Through discussions with them, one-on-ones. Asked them, did you join the Nazi Party? What did your parents do? What happened to them? What, were they involved in? What sort of activities were they involved in as kids? There was a camp in New Hampshire called Stark, and it's in the book because one of the GIs by the name of Tausig was a military policeman there. That particular camp was made up of about 200 POWs, and was pretty much former newspaper people, artists, poets, and that group was historically anti-Nazis. They hated the Nazi Party. Incidentally, one of the major reasons this re-education program took place was that the US government spent $341 billion to win World War II, to pay for ships, planes, tanks, the whole enchilada. Then after the war in 1948, we had the Marshall Plan that paid out $13 billion. $2 billion went to rebuild Germany. Now think about this. We bombed the major German cities. We carpet bombed them. We used napalm. We bombed all the bridges. We ruined the infrastructure for the marketplaces. So we needed leadership to lead a democratic Germany, to help build the infrastructure and to manage the money that we were funneling in as the Marshall Plan. And the first chancellor of Germany was Konrad Adenauer, who was an anti-Nazi. He was the former mayor of Cologne that was jailed by Hitler. Then after the war, the Allies put him in power. Eisenhower was the temporary, let's say, head of the, let's say, Allied area of West Germany. He was the governor of West Germany. And then Adenauer took over as the first chancellor. So this whole re-education effort was important in having people that were mayors and government officials and their version of congressmen, parliament people.
Okay. Did your research include in-depth insight into the Ritchie boys story?
No, I avoided them intentionally because there were already books on it, and the Ritchie boys were pretty much involved in interrogating Germans and providing intelligence in Europe. And then they were even doing some of that in the US. So there were already books there, and I wanted to avoid any possible, let's say, plagiarism or duplication of effort. So I steered clear of them.
Okay. RJ wants to know, why was your father chosen to work in the camps?
Okay. I think it was the Army. First of all, they needed someone in supply to go to that particular camp. So I don't have this locked down factually. This is just what I suppose because he was put in charge of a supply depot. The more interesting question was, why was he asked to go inspect the German general's quarters, and especially von Arnim? Now, there's a very interesting story about that, and I learned this from the book that my, let's say, my advisor wrote on the German generals interned in the United States. And it turns out that the Clinton prisoner of war camp was commanded by Colonel James McElhaney. Now, the name McElhaney, it's the same family that owns the McElhaney Tabasco sauce. And so that this is just weird coincidence, one of these coincidences. But McElhaney was a World War I veteran, and he had very bad experiences with the Germans in World War I. And according to the book that my colleague wrote, that it turned out that McElhaney didn't like Germans very much. And so he could think of no better way of getting back at the Germans than having a Jewish sergeant go inspect the quarters. But there's a much deeper story here, all right? And it turns out that when von Arnim was captured in May 1943, Clinton wasn't in existence yet. They had to build the camp, all right? And so that they sent von Arnim to an estate in England along with 3 or 4 other German generals. And there they lived the life of royalty. And the British always treated their prisoners, especially officers, with the, let's say, the grandeur that they would want to receive as officers. So these officers, German officers, had cigars. They had cognac after their meals. They had silk pajamas. They had magnificent meals. They just didn't know that all their rooms were bugged and that they were trying to learn information about the war by giving them what they want. So von Arnim gets transferred to Clinton, and this is out in rural Mississippi, not near anything. Clinton was a very small town. You're 30 miles away from Jackson, Mississippi. And so that he's in a wooden hut with an orderly and around barbed wire fence, and there's woods there. And so he starts making demands of McElhaney. All right, me and the generals and I, we want cigars and we want cognac. We want a tennis court. We want a clay tennis court so that the officers could play tennis and the enlisted men could play tennis. Well, McElhaney denied every one of these. And when the International Red Cross and the Swiss delegations came to the camp, they interviewed von Arnim and the other generals to see how they were being treated. And von Arnim groused about this and complained. And then the International Red Cross complained to the Provost Marshal's office in Washington, D.C. And then they in turn told McElhaney, okay, lay off this guy, give him something. So they gave him the concrete tennis court, and that was it. So there was no doubt that McElhaney was ticked off, and he wanted to stick it to von Arnim and the other generals by having a Jewish GI go search their quarters. But also it's a way of him showing in the United States, we have freedom of religion. So I could send anyone. It could have been a Muslim. It could have been a Hindu. All right. Greenberg just happened to be at the right place in the right time. So off they sent him to do this work. Thanks for your question.
Yeah, very nice. So what happened to von Arnim?
Von Arnim was released. He went back home, and he was never tried for anything because the books that came out, you know, all the facts about the atrocities against the Jews didn't come out until, well after he died, 1947. Was it 1962 he died? So one book called Nazi Palestine, The Plans for the Extermination of the Jews in Palestine, was written by two German historians. It was written in German, and then it was translated into English in 2010. And it's chilling, the plans that they had for the Middle East. Fortunately, the Afrika Corps was defeated in El Alamein and driven back into Tunisia. Another book called Among the Righteous talks about the long stories of the Holocaust and its long reach into the Arab lands. And one thing people may not know about is that the Grand Mufti, and I didn't know about this until I started doing research after reading these books, that the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was the spiritual, religious, and political leader of the Muslim world during the war years. And he went to Nazi Germany and had an audience with Adolf Hitler. And this is documented all over the place, where he volunteered to set up extermination camps in Palestine, in Israel, and in Egypt. And all they needed was for the Afrika Corps to come in and take over these countries. In addition, after the war, the British never put this man up for trial because there wasn't any crimes that he committed at that point. He just met and he was on the payroll of Nazi Germany. But the Grand Mufti of Jerusalem was significant in the post-war period of when Israel and Palestine split and Israel was formed. He was the one that put Arafat in charge of the PLO. And so that the history of what happened to the war transcends and enters the politics of what presently is undergoing or underwent in the Middle East. So thank you for your question.
Okay, well, I think that wraps up our question and answer portion. Mike, Dr. Greenberg, thank you so much for sharing your book and your research with us. And just to let you know at home, the library does have copies of Mike's book in our collection. We have a print copy. We also have an ebook copy. So be sure to check that out if you are a fan of digital books. Dr. Greenberg, thank you so much.
Well, thank you all, and have a great night. And if you read the book, please, you could look me up and drop me a line. I'd love to hear from you, what you thought about it.
That sounds wonderful. Thank you for your at home. We'll see you next time. Have a great night.